So, welcome everyone to our Ritual and Remembrance series. My name is Jennifer Arvisu, and I'm the Operations Manager with Roots and Roads. Gonna go ahead. So you should all be here for Jewish perspectives on rituals of death and mourning. And before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and go over some of the Zoom controls while we let folks in the waiting room. So as you might all realize right now, you are muted and you will remain so during the rest of the session. So that's just so that we can pay special attention to our presenter without any interruptions. But you do have access to your video. So down at the bottom of the screen, there is a little video icon. You can start and stop your video. We do hope that you will show your lovely faces. It's always nice when the presenter can see who they're presenting to. So if you're so inclined, we would love to see you. But if you prefer to stay behind the scenes, we completely understand. So for tonight, if you have any comments or questions, we're going to ask you to put that in the chat. That's that little chat icon down at the bottom. If you have any Zoom related questions, I'll be monitoring that. But also any questions that pop up for you during the presentation, you can put them in the chat. And when it's time for the Q&A, David will read those off for our presenter. And last, up at the right-hand corner, there's a view icon. That's where you can toggle between speaker view. So if you'd like to focus in on the speaker and her presentation, you'll want to click that. If you do want to see kind of who's in the room with us tonight, that's going to be the gallery view. And so with that, for those of you who maybe don't know us, or this is the first time that you're attending a session, we are Roots and Roads Community Hospice Foundation. Our vision is to transform the end-of-life experience into the final act of living well, and we do that in 3 ways. So the first is by providing supplemental support for hospice patients and their loved ones, and that's for items ranging from utility assistance, housing, final arrangements, and things like that. And then we also do education for the community about end-of-life issues, such as the event that we're all here for tonight. And then we support healthcare decisions through our online resource called the Crosswalk. So it kind of walks you through from a diagnosis to, differences between hospice and palliative care to final arrangements and bereavement. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to David Fife, our Director of Community Engagement.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And I think we're going to go to the next slide. Yes, we want to take a moment and thank all of these amazing people who donated specifically to bring this session to the community tonight. So we are so grateful for your participation, for your ideas, for your feedback, and also for your monetary donations that make it possible for us to continue to bring this series to the community free of charge. So thank you so much to all these individuals. And we also want to acknowledge our 2025 sponsors, Desert Diamond Casino, Sunset Hospice, Casa de la Luz Hospice, Intermountain Centers, and Legacy Foundation of Southeast Arizona have all donated generously to make this year-long series a possibility. So thank you so much to all of these amazing organizations. And now we are going to focus our time on tonight's topic. Gila Silverman is the Education Program Manager at Shomer Collective. It's an organization dedicated to talking about death Jewishly. She holds a PhD in anthropology and a master's in public health, both from the University of Arizona, and a certificate in congregational health ministry from Andover Newton Theological School. She has published both ethnographic and personal writings on death and mourning, including most recently the New York Times Tiny Love Stories column. If you all get a chance, please look at this amazing piece. It is beautiful, and it was how long ago? It was not that long ago. It was about less than half a year ago, I believe. So I encourage you to read that and to read her full bio. But briefly, I'd like to say that I'm blessed. I'm blessed to have been able to collaborate with Gila for many years. She has allowed this Gentile to hang out with her, and gratefully, our paths continue to cross. So Gila is a person of great wisdom and insight, compassion and humor. We are very grateful to have her with us tonight, and we will turn things over to you now, Gila.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I would say I am honored that you let me hang out with you. So it's a mutual admiration society here tonight. I'm really happy to be here and to be with you and to share with you some of my experience and some of my community's experiences. I am going to try to share some slides to get us started. I will also just mention the New York Times piece. It was in the column called Tiny Love Stories, where you have 100 words or less to tell any kind of a love story. And it's amazing how hard it is to say something in fewer words. And it's what I wrote and what was published in, I think, in February. And it's very timely because this weekend is Father's Day. It was a very short anecdote about an interaction I had with my father a few weeks before he died. And the important conversations that happened at the end of life in ways that often aren't how you think they're going to happen. So I am honored, and if I have a moment later, I'll add a link in the chat. But for now, let me try to share my slides. Wait a minute. Okay, do you see that slides? Yes. Okay. Let's do this. Let me just rearrange, make sure I can see all the other things that I need to see here.
Yeah, that looks great. Yep.
Okay, we got it. Great. Okay, so thank you again to Roots and Roads for inviting me, and to Jennifer and David for making this evening happen and taking care of all the behind the scenes. Just so you know, my plan for this evening is to talk for about 30 minutes or so. So you'll hear a lot of my voice at the beginning. And then hopefully we'll open things up and we will just have a conversation about where this all takes us. So there we go. So as you heard in my bio, I work for an organization called Shomer Collective. Shomer is the Hebrew word for guard. In traditional Jewish practice, a shomer is the person who stays with the body from death until burial, accompanying the soul as it departs from the human realm. We see our work as accompanying people as they talk about death Jewishly and as they learn how to live with awareness of our mortality. We say that our mission is to leverage Jewish wisdom to transform communal culture around death and dying. And we do that through public programs, professional trainings and gatherings, curation of resources. And at the end, I'll share with you our website and hope you'll join us for other programs if you're interested in learning more about Jewish approaches and Jewish wisdom on these topics. So some of what I'm going to share with you tonight comes from our work at Shomer Collective. Some of it comes from my own academic research that I've been doing for the last 10 years in this area. And some of it, as you'll hear, comes from my own personal life experience. As most of us who do this work, as is true for most of us who do this work, the professional and the personal are often very hard to separate. So let me start. I can get this to click. There we go. I'm going to start with the personal. There's a Jewish tradition that you dedicate a study session in someone's memory. So I want to dedicate our learning tonight to the memory of my mother, Phyllis Silverman. You see her picture and her books on your screen. Last week, we marked the 9th anniversary of her death, so it's very timely that I will be here discussing her work with you tonight. So I will dedicate our learning to her memory, to the blessing of her memory. My mother was a grief researcher. She spent 50 years conducting research with the bereaved and developing programs to support the grieving and writing many books. I put 2 of them on the screen here that are 2 of the most, I think 2 of the most important and 2 of the most relevant. And we'll talk about this as I go through my presentation. So I want to start with a few things that I learned and that the world learned from my mother's research. I wasn't sure what to call this slide. I called it Wisdom from Phyllis. I don't know. So she found in her research, in her many, many years of research with widows, with grieving children, with birth mothers, with widowers, that bereavement is a time of change, that it's normal and expected part of the life cycle transition. It is not a medical problem that needs medical attention. That grief is something we need to understand as social and relational, not always as an individual psychological issue. Perhaps most importantly, my mother and her colleagues, Dennis Class and Steve Nickman, developed the theory of continuing bonds. You saw the book Continuing Bonds on the previous slide. And if you were here for the first session of this series, you heard Dr. Candy Khan talk about continuing bonds and the importance of this theory and how it's changed our thinking. What they found was building on decades of their separate research projects. They were each working with different populations of people, of grieving people, and they recognized that across all these populations, people did not disconnect from their loved ones who had died, which was the theory at the time, 30, 40 years ago. Rather, they found that we all accommodate to loss by building a different and ongoing relationship with someone who is no longer physically present, what they called a continuing bond. My mother also told us, meaning the family, she would say, Jews do grief well. But her research didn't focus on religion, so it wasn't anything that she ever wrote or talked about in her professional life. I just heard her say it a lot growing up. And I never stopped to think about what it meant until after she died. And I started doing my own research into this area. And I started to really understand what she meant and what she was referring to, which is that Jewish tradition really turns out to be a good example of a framework for guiding mourners as they adjust to a new life without the deceased. And it provides lots of opportunities to develop and maintain continuing bonds, not only between individuals and the person who's died, but also among families and among communities, and between the dead person and the community in which they lived and other communities in which they had influence. So my cursor is not, there we go. So I want to take a look at some of these rituals now tonight. I want to acknowledge, before I go any further, that Jewish tradition encompasses millennia of texts, traditions, laws, rituals, debates, arguments, diversities. It probably makes more sense to speak of Judaisms and Jewish approaches to death, dying, and bereavement, and really to anything, rather than a singular Jewish approach. There's a joke that if you have two Jews, you'll have at least 3 opinions. So please keep that in mind as you listen to my talk tonight, and understand that I'm going to share with you my perspective, but you might hear very different things if someone else was giving the talk. And there are actually many, many different practices and customs within and between different Jewish communities, differences by denomination, differences by geography, differences by ethnic background, like many, many things. I also want to acknowledge that I'm focusing tonight on rituals that relate to individuals and the death of a person. Judaism also has many rituals for communal grief, for marking historic events, and that's a different talk. I'm not going to address that now. And we also know that there's many, many kinds of grief. I think you've done a wonderful job in this series of acknowledging so many of those different kinds of grief. But I'm focusing here really on rituals that were designed to help us mourn the death of a person who is close and important to us. So in this presentation, I'm mostly also going to focus on post-death and mourning rituals, but I did want to briefly mention one end-of-life ritual, which is called the vidui, or the confessional. I think if you ask most people, if you said a deathbed confessional, people picture a priest, right? A priest being a caller, being brought in. Yeah, I don't know. I know it from movies, but other people, I'm sure many of you here know this from having done these rituals with people or for people. So people are often surprised to discover that Judaism also has a deathbed confessional. It's called the vidui. The vidui is also the prayer, one of the many prayers that's said on Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the Jewish year, when we ask for forgiveness and reflect on our lives. And so there's a variation of the Yom Kippur vidui that is, it's been modified for use at the end of life. It's a statement of forgiveness and of faith. And it is supposed to be said as close to the moment of death as possible. Obviously, we don't always know when that can be, and many people in those moments can't speak. So the vidui can be said by the person who is dying or by someone else on their behalf. And importantly, I want to note, unlike last rites, it does not have to be said by a rabbi. Anyone can say the vidui. And there are also like multiple variations of it that have been created in recent years, and some of them are really quite beautiful. So I just want to make sure I acknowledge that I think most Jewish people even don't know that there are rituals for before the death, but there are, where they've just been lost and we're slowly now bringing them back. Now, once a death has happened, a whole series of ritual practices is set into motion if someone is observing the traditional Jewish ways. Judaism prescribes a fixed set of rituals and prohibitions for the funeral, for the burial, for the first week, the first month, and the first year after a death. What you see in front of you is a basic timeline, and I thank my colleagues for creating this they created it for a different project we're working on, and I stole it from their slideshow because I think it's such a great visual for this timeline. And we're going to look at each of these stages next. But the basic overview is the first is called aninut, which means mourning. And aninut is the time of entry into mourning from the time of death until after the burial. That includes the funeral and the burial. After that comes Shiva, the 7 days, the week of mourning. Then Shloshim, which is the first 30 days, the first month of mourning, and then a full year, which in Hebrew is Shana. And then after that, we go on and we have ongoing annual remembrances for the lifetime of whoever is mourning the person. So these
And I
traditional...
wanted to tell everybody, Gila, that nobody has to panic. We're going to send these out.
Yes.
So don't worry, you'll get but not only the slides, but a recording of this as well. So don't worry about needing to take pictures and copy everything down.
Yeah. And I will say, I tried to, whenever I'm using a Hebrew word, I try to put the word in Hebrew transliteration and English translation. If you hear me say a word and you don't know what it is, please ask in the chat. Again, I try really hard to catch that, but sometimes I don't even realize I'm saying something that's not English because I use these words so often. So going back to mourning. So traditional mourning practices, the Hebrew word is avelut, which just means mourning. Evel is grief. Avelut is the state of being in mourning. So this whole process is called the year of avelut. And it's guided by two central kind of ethical principles. Kvod hamet, which means respect for the dead, and nichum avelim, which is comforting the mourners. And so all of the rituals that I'm going to describe emerge out of those two key concerns, right? Jewish tradition also defines who is officially considered a mourner. It's parents, children, siblings, and spouse of the person who has died. And again, this is what I'm describing now is traditional Judaism. In today's world, many people will put themselves into this category for a friend, for a significant person who maybe wasn't a spouse. There's all kinds of other relationships, but what I'm describing here is the traditional approach. Just want to clarify that. Judaism also defines how long people are considered a mourner. So interestingly, it's 1 year for the death of a parent and only 30 days for the death of a spouse, child, or siblings. We can talk about that maybe in the discussion later. And the tradition outlines the obligations and the prohibitions guiding the mourner's behavior as they move through the process over the course of that whole mourning period. So let's take a look now at each of these stages. So first is aninut, from immediately after the death to the funeral. This is the liminal time between the death and the funeral. The central task of this phase is to bury the dead respectfully and promptly. Jewish funerals traditionally are scheduled as soon as possible after the death, which in some communities and communities that are geographically close in and tend to be more observant and have everything in place to function automatically. And in Israel, this means a funeral can happen within hours of a death, very, very quickly. In the US today, the goal is to have the funeral within 24 hours, but because of various state-by-state public health regulations and people's need to travel, it often takes a little bit longer, but the goal really is to have the funeral as soon as possible. For those of you who have Netflix, I watched the comedian Sarah, this is an aside. The comedian Sarah Silverman has a show out right now about the deaths of her parents. And she describes this part of the Jewish ritual as farm to table funeral, which is slightly, if you know Sarah Silverman's humor, it's inappropriate, but there's also something to it. It says you're moving things, as quickly as you can. So we try to do that. And during this time, beginning with Aninut, mourners are released from all of their usual religious and social obligations. Their focus really is on, they're released from everything else so they can just focus on preparing the funeral and making sure that they properly honor the dead by respectfully burying them. Before the funeral, the body is prepared for burial with a ritual cleansing known as a tahara, which means purification. This is conducted by a group of community volunteers called the Chevra Kadisha, the Sacred Society, which has been specially trained for this purpose. During the tahara, the body is ceremonially washed, blessed, dressed in a shroud, and placed in the casket. Because Judaism decrees that all are equal in death, traditionally all Jews, regardless of gender, wealth, or status, are buried in simple white linen garments and in a simple wood casket. And this is in response to the biblical injunction from Genesis, from dust you are and to dust you shall return. So the casket, the linen, it's all designed to be things that will decompose quickly and will not interfere with that process, with our return to the earth. The Jewish funeral is usually very simple. It's very, very simple. There's a reading from Psalms, there's a eulogy, and there's a recitation of a memorial prayer called El Malei Rachamim, which has an incredibly haunting memory. And for many of us, just the music takes us, we associate it with funerals and memorial services. Before the funeral, the immediate family is gathered sort of off to the side, and they participate in a ritual called the kri'ah, the ripping, where they will literally either rip a garment. I'm not going to do it to my nice jacket, but you will rip your clothing, or in some places they'll have a special black ribbon and you manually with your hands rip the ribbon or rip the shirt as a sign. This is based again on a biblical story, the biblical story of Jacob's response when he's told of his son's death. And it symbolizes that the death has torn our world irreparably. And that torn garment or ribbon is worn for some people throughout the entire week of Shiva, and for some people just for the full day of the funeral. One of the most striking aspects of a Jewish burial, if you've ever been to a Jewish funeral, you've seen this, is the requirement that the mourners themselves need to be the ones to fill the grave. So what that means is that after the casket is lowered, the immediate family and then all those present take turns placing shovels of earth. There'll be a big mound of dirt next to the grave, and everyone will take turns placing shovels of earth into the grave until it is full. One other thing is that traditionally you do this with the shovel upside down to show your reluctance, that you don't really want to be completing the task. So you're filling a grave with an upside down shovel, and everyone who is there does some piece of this. The community is taking on this responsibility. It's incredibly powerful. So the mourners, after that is complete, the mourners then recite their mourner's prayer, marking the end of the Aninut period and their transition into the mourning, the Avilut, the next stage. And at this time, what you'll also see as the service itself is finished is that all those who are present will form two lines from the graveside back to the cars or wherever people are leaving from. And the mourners will walk through the two lines of people as the rabbi and those who are standing there recite the phrase in Hebrew or in English, "May you be comforted among the mourners in Zion." And this is a way of an outward sign that the community is now transitioning from a focus on taking care of the dead to comforting the mourners, and that as they leave the cemetery, they should be accompanied by this comfort provided by the community as they're on their way. No? Okay. After the funeral, the family returns to the home, and that begins the next section of the mourning ritual, which is the Shiva. Shiva comes from the Hebrew word Sheva, which means 7. The mourners, this is the 7-day mourning period right after the burial. During the Shiva, the mourners continued to be freed from all social obligations in order to focus on their grief and are meant to be taken care of by the community. They return to the home, where sometimes you'll see a wash basin, a bucket, or a pitcher of water and a basin. So people can wash their hands before they come into the house to purify themselves symbolically from contact with the dead at the cemetery. Mourners also light a special candle that burns for the 7 days. I have a little picture of one. It's very hard to find, this is an aside, but it's very hard to find pictures to go with this, so the slides tend to be very wordy, but there's a picture of the memorial candle. And the candle burns for all 7 days of the Shiva. It's a special candle for that purpose. Also, all the mirrors in a Shiva house are covered so that the bereaved should not be concerned with their own outward appearance. They should only be focused inward. During the Shiva period, the mourners stay at home. They're prohibited from working, from going to school, from cooking, shaving, wearing makeup, taking care of household tasks, wearing new clothes, or engaging in any kinds of pleasure. This time period is also referred to as sitting Shiva, because the mourners sit low to the ground. Some synagogues now will provide special chairs that keep you low to the ground. Some people will just turn chairs on their side or sit on the floor. And that comes from the book of Job, where Job's friends come to comfort him after his many losses. And they say that it says he's sitting to the earth. So we sit low to the ground during that time period. So this is very much a communal process. The entire community is obligated to attend a funeral. It's considered a very high mitzvah, a commandment, accompanying the dead to their final resting place. And everyone is also obligated to make a visit to the Shiva house and to comfort the mourners. The door to the home should remain open and unlocked for most of the day, so visitors can come and go. The mourners are not supposed to cook or clean, so the community brings food for them and make sure that whatever other practical needs they have are taken care of. And it's also traditional for people to make charitable donations in memory of the deceased at this time, and to make a donation to something that was important to them also as a way of honoring their memory. And the central ritual of the Shiva week is the Shiva Minyan, which is a daily service that happens, if you're Orthodox, 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. If you're not so Orthodox, it happens once a day, usually in the evening. And the reason that there's this service in the home is that the bereaved are obligated to recite the mourner's prayer, the Kaddish it's called, on a daily basis for the duration of their mourning. So, and in order to say this, they need the presence of a minyan, a quorum of 10 Jews. Because they can't leave the house, the quorum has to come to them. And so the community makes sure that there's always enough people to do this service and to have it in the home each day, each night, depending on how observant they are. And then Shiva ends the following the morning service on the 7th day after the funeral. And there's a custom that at that point, the mourners get up. It's called getting up from Shiva. So you get up out of your low chairs and you go for a walk around the block as a symbolic of showing I'm starting to go back out into the world. If you're really Orthodox, this is literally the first time you've left the house in a week. I'll just throw in another personal anecdote. My brother, I grew up in a somewhat traditional home. My brother is more observant than I am. We had a argument, I will say, when we were sitting Shiva for my mother about whether we could leave the house to take the garbage can to the curb. I said yes, he said no. Then a friend came over and saw I was overwhelmed and took me out for a walk in the woods. And my brother said I shouldn't do that. And I said, yes, I should. So, right, there's all different ways of doing this. But that's also in a more traditional context. That probably tells you more about my sibling relationship than about our tradition, but there you have it. I want to just take a moment to pause here. because I've spent a lot of time talking about the funeral and the Shiva because those are the most visible parts of Jewish mourning. And that's the part that most people, whether you're in or part of the community or not, you're going to encounter. And I think one of the most common questions I get asked in my work is, what do I say to someone who's mourning? And what do I do at a Shiva visit? Like I want to go, but I'm not sure what to do. Or I know I'm supposed to go, or is it okay if I go? Right? All of those kinds of questions. So first thing I want to say is if you hear about a funeral, a Jewish funeral or a Shiva, you don't wait to be invited, you go, right? You just go. Everyone is just supposed to show up. The funeral and the Shiva are usually announced in some sort of public forum and you go. You just go. This is not considered a social visit. So you enter the house quietly, you don't knock, you don't wait for someone to welcome you. You just go in, you'll see there's a part of the house where people are gathered. And usually you should just, the tradition is to go in and remain silent. There's actually a teaching that says that you do not speak to a mourner unless they speak to you first, recognizing that they may not want to talk to anyone. And our role is just to be there and to be present. Our role is not to have to engage them in conversation. At the same time, there are a couple of traditional phrases that we say. So I thought I would just share some of those with you. So you have them in your proverbial back pockets. The most common one that you hear is "May their memory be a blessing," which has, interestingly, in the last few years, come into popular use in American culture. It also comes from a biblical, like many of the things I'm mentioning, it comes from a biblical source. It comes from a verse in Proverbs that says, quote, "The memory of the righteous is a blessing." So what you're essentially saying is there's one interpretation that you're saying, may their memory be a blessing, which means they were a righteous soul. And also, I think in modern interpretations, we can interpret this phrase to be, may your memories of them be a blessing to you in your life. I think of that as a kind of continuing bonds phrase, right? That may you continue to be blessed with these memories that you have and with the ways that they influenced your life. You'll sometimes see in Jewish contexts, and you'll see this a little bit later on one of the slides, you'll see after someone's name the letter ZL. ZL stands for the Hebrew Zichronam Livracha, which is may their memory be a blessing in Hebrew. So it's a way of indicating that someone has died. You put the ZL in parentheses after their name. Other phrases that you might hear, I already mentioned one that's said at the funeral and that is often said to people during Shiva. May you be comforted among the other mourners or among the mourners of Zion and Israel. Again, these are all biblical in their origins. That one in Hebrew, Hamakom tenachem etchem toch shar avlei Tzion, which is, I love this one because it says you're not alone, right? You're not the only one who's mourning. There are other people mourning, and may you find comfort the way they also did. I recently spoke to someone who had just been sitting Shiva for her mother-in-law, and she said they actually decided they hated this phrase because all of the Jewish traditions were about making them uncomfortable, right? They were in these they were sitting on the floor, they were not wearing comfortable clothes, right? People were coming and visiting them. And so it felt contradictory to her that when they were in the discomfort of their grief, people were offering them comfort. They felt like they should be sitting with their discomfort, which I found incredibly powerful. And I'm sharing it with you because several weeks after I talked to her, I'm still pondering that one. Another one, which I find quite lovely, comes from the Sephardic, the Middle Eastern Jewish communities. They say, Min hashamayim tinuchumu, may you be comforted from the heavens, or may you be comforted from the skies. And I think, again, you can interpret these in many different ways. I think of it as, may you be comforted by looking at the stars. May you be comforted by the beauty around you. May you be comforted from the heavens, from God, whatever that means to you. And of course, so those are sort of phrases you can use. But of course, the other thing is you don't need to say anything at all, right? You can just sit. Sometimes the best thing to do is just to sit quietly, to ask for a story. Right? If you don't know the name of the person, I mean, if you're not visiting Shiva, if you've just heard someone's person died, you can say, tell me about them. Just tell me about your person. If you did know them, you can share a memory if you're asked to. think a lot of people feel that they have an obligation, like, let me tell you how I knew your person. And some people want to hear that and some people don't. So always check first, can I share a story with you about the impact this person had on me at the time? So those are just a couple of practical pieces of advice. So after Shiva, I would say most American Jews stop the mourning traditions after sitting Shiva, and often they do only in a shortened version of Shiva, if at all. I'll come back to that in a minute, but the traditional timeline continues with Shloshim, which is 30. During Shloshim, people they slowly return to daily life, continuing the mourning obligations and the prohibitions. So they go to the synagogue now every day to say the prayer. After the 7 days, they have to go out to do that. But they continued to refrain from shaving, from haircuts, from new clothes, from social gatherings, listening to music, etc. And I know some people say, well, that sounds really punitive, but a lot of people actually find it quite a relief. They don't have to put on a happy face, and they have a reason to not go to things, right? They don't want to be trying to act normal and just, be out at events, and they can say, I'm sorry, I can't come to your party, right? It's Shloshim and I'm in mourning now, and it gives you an out, which again, some people find very helpful. The end of Shloshim for most people is the end of the most stringent mourning prohibitions and the end of the official mourning period for most relatives. And in Sephardic traditions and in Israel, at the end of the month, there will be what we call the unveiling, the putting in of the gravestone. I don't know, there's a word for that, but we call it the unveiling of the gravestone. That happens again in Sephardic and in Israeli communities. That happens after a month. In the US, we tend to do that at the end of the year. So different traditions. And then for those mourning a parent, the mourning period continues for the rest of the year. The primary among those is the daily recitation of the Kaddish, the morning prayer, and the prohibitions on listening to music or attending celebrations, and also I think new clothes. You're supposed to not do any of those things for up to a year, unless it's an immediate family member, and then there are exceptions that are made. And then the period of mourning ends at the first anniversary of the death, which is known in the US as Yurtzeit, which is a Yiddish word that means a year's time. And at that point, you would light a 24-hour memorial candle, go to the synagogue, say the Kaddish prayer. And again, if you're in the US, that's when you would do the unveiling of the gravestone. There's no, interestingly, there's no actual official ritual for unveiling the gravestone. Everyone thinks there is. And you have to have a rabbi, and that's not true. There's no rabbi, there's no ritual. You can do whatever you want. There's a couple of prayers you can say, but mostly it's the family can decide what they want to do. And then after that, it continues. It doesn't end. In Jewish tradition, the memory of the deceased continues to be honored for the lifetime of the mourner. They observe the anniversary of the death every year. They light a memorial candle. They say Kaddish in the synagogue. And then 4 times a year in the Ashkenazi, the Eastern European tradition, we have this special Yizkor, which means memory, or we will remember service at the major holidays as part of the synagogue service. So you see that it's ongoing, right? The maintaining the memory is ongoing. So and now I want to complicate everything I've just said. I already did some of this. I hinted at it. Everything I've described so far is what tradition prescribes, but what are people really doing, right? That's the difference in the academic world. We talk about, the textual religion versus lived religion. So what are people actually doing? It's very different than what you just heard. So this image will be familiar to many of you. This is a graphic that has been used to talk about the stages of grief that were first identified by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. The image on the left is sort of how people interpret her stages. And the image on the right is what grief actually looks like. Now, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself said, that's not what I meant. It's not linear and not everybody goes through those stages and it doesn't happen that way. But this has sort of stuck in popular culture. And the parallel to ritual is not exact, but as I was preparing for this presentation, it struck me that this image really does describe the realities of the many ways in which people are navigating, negotiating with, rejecting, recreating, moving between, doing all kinds of different things along the way throughout their mourning period with these different rituals. So this is my improvised version of trying to modify the graphic, but I think it's accurate. I think that just like grief is not linear, also the way we move through our grief rituals is also not linear. So, whoops, okay, that was supposed to all show, no, okay, there we go. So we at Shomer Collective, we wanted to understand why so many people were moving away from or simply not doing the Jewish traditions. And we wanted to think about how we could revitalize these traditions because we think they're very powerful and very wise. So a few years ago, we conducted a series of interviews and focus groups and talked to a whole lot of people specifically about their experiences with sitting Shiva. We heard a lot of stories. And what emerged really clearly was that because of geographic mobility, because of assimilation into mainstream American culture, because of the general trend away from organized religion in our society, as well as our general discomfort with talking about death, we've lost both the knowledge of how to do these traditions and the intergenerational communities that we need in order for these community-based traditions to actually work. I say work in quotes, but for them to happen, right? And for people to find them meaningful. So we're now in the process of developing a project to respond to some of these challenges. The project is called Shiva Circle. It will be a combination of a digital platform for organizing Shiva, a collection of curated resources, and training for Shiva guide, what we're calling Shiva guides, who are people who will support the mourners during the week of Shiva and beyond. The project is in development and being piloted. It will be launched sometime this summer. There are many resources already on our website. And again, I'll give you a link to that later. So that's just a sneak preview of something that's coming. And you can see there also, if you notice the eye on the word Shiva is meant to look like one of those the Shiva ribbons that are torn. We work with really good graphic designers. So that was their idea, which I think is beautiful. So that's just a sneak peek at what's coming. So as I've already said, right, there are many Jews and many different ways to mourn Jewishly. What we saw in our research and what I've heard in many, many conversations over the last 10 years is that I'm making generalizations here, but sort of many non-Orthodox American Jews view Jewish mourning rituals as a menu from which to choose the pieces that they find personally meaningful and practical for their lives, right? Because our lives, for the most part, we don't live exclusively in Jewish communities. We don't have bereavement policies that allow us to take off a week, right, to sit Shiva. There's practicalities of life that have to be attended to. And so as with anything Jewish, there isn't one single experience or understanding. Some mourners find these traditions really meaningful and really helpful, and others find them difficult or irrelevant or annoying or some combination of all of the above. That's that graphic that I showed you earlier. So let me just give you a couple of examples. As I mentioned, many people don't sit Shiva at all, or they sit Shiva for the first 3 days, as these are considered the most intense periods, the most intense days of the mourning period. Some people welcome visitors only during pre-announced visiting hours. So you'll see an announcement that says Shiva will be at the house for, on Monday from 5 to 7. And that's it, as opposed to the door is open and we're here for the week. And they, when they do that, they're basically saying, leave us alone the rest of the time, right? We don't want you coming and going all day long. This is when we're going to see people. So the mourners are controlling that piece of things. In some communities, it's considered the norm to have catering. Someone told me just yesterday, it came up, they said you have to make sure that on the like pre-death checklist is like, did you hire the caterer yet? Do you have the caterer on hold for when you know someone's in hospice? So some communities, the catering is very important. In others, it's very important that the community provide all the food, and catering is kind of considered like not cool. I was going to say not kosher, but that's that's a yes, but sometimes it is kosher catering. In some communities, people bring desserts, and I lost my page. They bring a lot of dessert because they say, well, the visitors need food to eat, and the mourners will prepare their own meals. In other places, people want to feed the mourners and don't care about the visitors. It's very varied. But the important thing is sort of there's a disconnect, right? We live in a larger culture in which grief is really seen as a private matter. And so for people, this communal Shiva feels very awkward to a lot of people. Many people do not want to be seen by others and do not want to see others in the early stages of raw grief. And many guests or Shiva comforters do not really know or feel comfortable with the tradition of silence. They just can't do it, right? To come into a house and not feel obligated to either make someone feel better or to tell them their own story, or, right, there's all these things that people want to do that just make it all very uncomfortable. And the other piece where we see a lot of variation is around the mourner's prayer, the Kaddish, which again, traditionally you would go either anywhere from 1 to 3 times a day to the synagogue. For a parent, you would go for the full, for 11 months, you would say that. Some people do that. They go every day. Some say it once a week, if they go on a Sabbath morning to the service. Other people, like if they happen to be in a synagogue for some reason during the year, they'll say the mourner's prayer, but they don't make an effort. Increasingly since the pandemic, we're seeing more and more people doing online minions, specifically for the purpose of St. Kaddish. I pulled this image on the screen here from an article about online Kaddish minions. That's a Zoom Kaddish minion. Everyone in that circle is there specifically to say the mourner's prayer. People zooming in from all over the country and supporting each other in their mourning. Yeah, and then people do all kinds of other variations. There's lots of ways to do this. Other people take on other kinds of activities and call those their Kaddish, like participating in a sport or an activity that the person who died liked to do or that was important to them. Maybe it's a volunteer project with an organization that was important to the person who died. Some people commit to a regular study or meditation practice. I have one friend who read a poem every morning at home. She said, this is my Kaddish. I know someone else who did I don't remember the whole story, but she did her hair in the way that her mother had done her hair. And she did it every morning. And she said, I have little kids. I can't make it to synagogue, but this I can do. And every morning I think of my mother when I do it. And for her, that was Kaddish. She said, this is my Kaddish. The image in the center of the slide here is from an artist called Day Schildkret, it's his name, who, when he was grieving, he started a practice that he calls mourning altars, and this is MORNING, the time of day. And he goes out, he lives somewhere in Northern California, and he goes out every morning, takes a walk on the land that he lives on, and he collects objects from the natural world and makes these altars, temporary altars each morning. And he did that as part of his grieving process, and now it's turned into a whole larger project. It's quite amazing. If you just look up mourningaltars.com, I think is his website, and he has just incredibly beautiful images. And I'm just gonna, before I move on, I just want to acknowledge the other images on the slide here. Just, I said, it's very hard to find images to talk about mourning rituals. It doesn't lend itself to visual imagery. The image on the left in the corner is a painting from 200 years ago of, that's actually deathbed vigil, deathbed where they're reading Psalms before the death. The image above that is there's a tradition in Judaism. We don't bring flowers to the grave. We put a stone on the grave, which is a more permanent marker that someone has been there and someone cares. So here you see a gravestone that has been visited many, many times with all the stones on it. And the image in the right corner is just there because I love it. That one is called the Barbie Minion. and an artist put it together to show the diversity and to show women taking on roles that were traditionally male, and women of all backgrounds and abilities, forming a quorum. And I include that because there is a gendered piece to all of these rituals. Judaism is a very patriarchal religion. Traditionally, Kaddish would only be said by sons. And for many women today who take on the ritual, even in our progressive communities, which are fully egalitarian, there is still a lot of challenge for women about finding places to say Kaddish where they will be welcome, because it's a more traditional practice. So I included that slide just because that image, because I like it. And it speaks to my own experience that I had. When I was saying Kaddish for my mother, I tried to go 3 or 4 times a week to the synagogue. I knew it was very important to her. I also started doing this ethnographic research about Kaddish, and I realized that was part of my Kaddish. And now when I speak about her work, as I've done tonight, I say this is part of my Kaddish, my ongoing way of remembering her. When my father died, it was different. At that point, I went to the synagogue weekly. I had had a conversation with him explicitly several months before he died. And I said, do you want us to say Kaddish? What do you want? And he said, you don't have to go every day. That's a lot of work. Go, I want you to go, go every Shabbat. That would be important to me. So that's what I did. But every morning that year, I also just sat in the morning for a few minutes and watched the seasons change outside my window, because that's what my father had done in the last months of his life. And it felt like a very important way to me to honor the lessons that he had learned in that very last part of his life. And I wanted to hold on to that and honor that also. So let me bring this section sort of to a close. I want to circle back to where I started. I said that Jewish mourning rituals are a good framework for guiding us through what we now understand about the process of grieving. So the question is, what can we learn from Jewish tradition that might help us think about rituals beyond the Jewish community in this very complicated modern world that we're living in? And here are a few things that I think we can all take, whether you observe Jewish rituals or don't observe Jewish rituals. I think this is what we can all learn from that. I think, first of all, we learn that we should not be grieving alone, that we need communities of care, right? From the funeral through the ongoing observance of Yizkor, Jewish tradition recognizes the living and the dead as part of a shared web of social and spiritual meaning. And it also gives both the individual and the community responsibilities in terms of the mourning process and supporting the mourners. And I think that's something we all can learn from. I also think it's really important to note these rituals recognize that ongoing mourning is accepted, expected, and supported by community norms. And it's not something that you need to seek professional help about. So again, within this larger context that really expects people to move on from their grief very, very quickly, the year of Jewish mourning rituals and these ongoing opportunities to remember the dead send us a very, very different message. As the year progresses, the rituals can serve as a constant reminder that it's okay. You're supposed to still be grieving, right? You're still in this ritual status of mourner. And that's really different than what people are hearing from the world outside of that space. Jewish tradition also acknowledges that the process takes time, that it's a process and it takes time. It's not something we do in one step. And we need to acknowledge and respect that process and find rituals or create rituals that will give us space for reflection, that encourage us to stay connected with those who are gone, and that support us as we find a new way of being in the world and a new self without the person who is gone. And in all of that, I think these rituals, having a daily ritual and an annual ritual are really important in the creation and the reinforcement and the acknowledgement of these continuing bonds that we have with the people who are gone physically, but not emotionally and spiritually. So to conclude this part of the presentation, I started with my mother. I'm going to end with a quote from my father. So 8 years ago, midway through the year that he said Kaddish for my mother, and you may, if you were paying attention, you heard that, for a spouse, it's 30 days. My dad said that wasn't enough. And he went every Saturday for the year after my mother died to say Kaddish. And he was asked by the synagogue to write about the experience. And this is part of what he wrote in his message to the synagogue about why he thought these rituals were important. He said, I go to a minyan, to a prayer service, on the Hebrew dates of the deaths of those closest to me, the yurtzites of my parents, my siblings, others. This is not merely out of respect to their memories. These are people who have been important to my development as a person, those who have helped to form me as the person I am today. But the person I am today changes from one year to the next in response to the experiences of that year. So I use the minyan to take another look at my relationship to those especially important people. How do I see them in light of these changes in myself? Have these new experiences, these new understandings changed my perspective on these relationships? This is perhaps the most important aspect of the minyan experience. Memory is important. As long as I commemorate their lives at the minyan, they continue to exist. So I think you can see in this quote, you can see my mother's work reflected in my father's words, which is not surprising, given that they were married for 50 years and he accompanied her to all of her conferences and edited all of her writing. So it's not surprising that there would be an influence there. But I hope that through what I've shared with you tonight, I've also helped make their memories a blessing and brought a little bit of both of them and their teachings to all of you also. Okay, there we go. So if you want more resources, and we will send this out later about anything I've talked about, you can go to our website, shomercollective.org. And if you want to be in touch with me, there's my email, gila@shomercollective.org. I'll leave that up for just a second so people can write it down if you want to. And then I'll take down the slides and we can have a discussion. So why don't I'm going to stop the share. Hold on.
Thank you so much, Gila. Thank you very much. So, folks, you're welcome to put questions into the chat. Just type those in, and then we'll lift them up to Gila as they come in. And we have one. Somebody says, "I'm curious to know what the Jewish community believes, or what are the beliefs that happen to a person's soul or spirit after they die?"
Okay, great question. Like everything Jewish, there's a lot of different answers. So the first answer, I think if you ask most non-Orthodox American Jews, they would say, oh, we don't believe in that. Jews don't talk about the afterlife. That's not part of our tradition. It is true that we don't have a focus on that. The focus is on living in this world today. You live a good life for the sake of living a good life, right? The emphasis is here, not later. At the same time, when you start to study these traditions, it becomes very clear that there is, in fact, a very strong belief in Jewish tradition, in an afterlife, in the soul's continuation, I guess you would say. All of these traditions really, in some ways, come from an understanding of like, we say the Kaddish and we do good deeds and we donate charity in order to elevate. We say in Hebrew, you say you're elevating the soul of the person. You're helping them move on to a higher something, whatever that is. And so that is very much built into these traditions. Also, if you study Jewish mysticism in the Kabbalah, which is an incredibly complex, complicated, difficult to understand, like many mystical texts. In the Kabbalah, in the mystical tradition, there is an elaborate system about the soul's journey through different realms and different levels of existence. I've studied that a little bit. I am by no means an expert in it. I can look at my bookshelf and recommend 3 or 4 books for those who are interested. Probably, actually, I'll write I'll put it in the chat. Probably the best expert in the Jewish world today is a man called Simcha Paul Raphael. And he has just committed his life. It's his life's work to studying Jewish views on death and dying and the afterlife. And he has written several books and teaches classes. And if you Google him and find his website, you'll find a lot of other information. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And what is the significance of the minion of the number 10?
You know, I don't know.
Okay. You could make
I
something
don't
up.
know. I just like, it's one of those questions where I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, I don't know. I never asked
Yeah.
all these years. I don't know. Every number, again, in Jewish mysticism, it's called gematria, is a system of numerology, and every number has every letter has a number, and the numbers all have significance, and you can take numbers and make letters out of them. I mean, make words out of them. My only guess, and I am absolutely making this up, so I don't know if it's true, is that the number 10 in numerology and gematria is the letter Yud, which is one of, which is the first letter of the is like what's called the tetragram, the 4-letter name of God. And also when you do an abbreviation for the name of God, sometimes it's Yud Yud. So maybe the number of 10 is connected to that, or maybe it's something else entirely. I don't know. And traditionally also it would be 10 men, 10 Jewish men. Women would not count towards the quorum. Obviously in the more liberal, modern, progressive, whatever word you want to use, denominations, women do count now towards the 10 people. Yeah.
I remember in Dr. Rachel Raymond's writings, she talked about a disagreement she had with her grandfather because he insisted that it needed to be 10 men because that's what the tradition was. And she said, well, why can't it be women as well? And she was disturbed by the disagreement, but
Yes.
it was just normal for him.
It's just right. For a lot of people, it's just what is. And I mean, and there's a lot of reasons for it that go into much more complicated, there's a whole I don't know how much detail to get into, but Jewish tradition has, it's a very legal religion, and it's a very structured set of behaviors. And according to Jewish law, there are certain commandments that are time bound and certain commandments that are not time bound. And so women are exempt from many of the time bound commitments because the understanding is they would be busy with childcare. Their role is, reproduction and childcare in the home. And because they're not obligated to time bound, they're not obligated to pray in the minyan 3 times a day. So therefore they wouldn't count towards the minyan. There's also another tradition that men are not allowed to hear women singing, because it would be sexually arousing to them. And so they also say women can't lead the prayers because that would be women's voices. So there's a whole lot of complexity to that discussion.
There's a lot of layers to that.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to everything Jewish. Yeah.
Great. That's great. And someone was just reflecting that they can't help but see the continuing bonds, principles, and the Jewish traditions reflected in rituals of other cultures like Dia de los Muertos as well.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. I think so. And one of the places it's interesting the way things come up. There's the movie. It's a Disney or an animated movie about what is it called? Is it Coco?
Yeah. Where
they go, right? The kid ends up in the other world, and as long as someone remembers the person, then they stay alive. And when I watched that movie, I thought, oh, that feels very Jewish. Because right, as long as someone says Kaddish on the yurt site, then the memory is still alive. And I have thought about that actually in recent years in my own family. My father was he kept a list of all of the yurt sites, all of the anniversaries of the deaths of the whole extended family, and he would make sure to go. And now that whole generation is gone, it occurred to me recently that we failed. We didn't continue that. Now, none of us of my generation are obligated to say the Kaddish for our grandparents and grandparents and aunts and uncles. but I know that he did. And every once in a while, I think I really have to go find his list and make a point of that. But there's a big gap between my intention and my implementation. So
Sure.
yes, anyway, yes, I'm agreeing with you.
That's
Dia de
great.
los Muertos feels very, resonates with me. Yeah.
I may be wrong about this. I was told this once in my understanding that viewing the body is discouraged
Yeah.
in Jewish tradition
Mhm.
and across different
Yeah.
denominations or how you and there's a reclaiming in modern society
Mhm.
around viewing the body now, spending time with the body. Is that changing within Judaism as well? And do you know much about the tradition
Um,
about discouraging viewing of the body?
yeah, I mean, I know it from experience. I know that it was not something that we did. And you know, when you hear about like an open casket funeral feels
Mhm.
very strange from a Jewish perspective. We don't do that. Also because, again, as part of that return to the earth, right? We don't do embalming, and we don't, and people would be prepared in that very simple shroud,
Mhm.
and the ritual washing and the shroud. So you wouldn't have an open casket, you wouldn't do a viewing. Those things just feel, I think it's about, again, I don't know the exact reason, but I think it's about respect for the dead.
Okay.
What it comes down to. But there is a different tradition, which is this idea of the shomer, the shomrim, who sit with the body, right?
Mhm.
So they're not viewing. I mean, the body is covered, but there is a tradition you don't leave the body alone. And so often, if someone dies at home, right, the family will stay with the body until, you know, until the funeral home comes. And then you will have people from the community who will sign up and take turns sitting with the body until the
Hmm.
funeral. So it's a different reason and a different tradition, but there's some parallels to it.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. And if we can stay a little bit longer on the theme of
Mhm.
being with the body, you spoke
Yeah.
about the ritual purification, the
Yeah.
washing of the body.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Who is part of that community that would take part in that
Yeah.
purification? Is each community of faith or synagogue or temple
Mhm.
have a group that is their role?
Yeah, so this is something that it's really fascinating, and there's really interesting revitalization, I will say,
Hmm.
of the tradition. Um, so historically, right, Jewish communities, people lived in small communities that were geographically central. Jewish tradition, if you're observant, you don't drive or do work or use electricity, all kinds of things on the Sabbath. So people would all live in a close community, walking distance to the synagogue, to each other. Um, and so there would be people from the community who were trained to do this. I think it was the older people in the community who did this. They were available, they had time, and it was sort of, you had to reach a certain level of maturity. It was traditionally anonymous. You were not, as part of respecting the dignity of the dead, you wouldn't ever talk about being part of it. And it was also always, men do the washing for men and women for women. So there'd be two chevra kadishas, one, you know, for the different genders. And it was very quietly done. You know, people would get a phone call and they would come. Um, what's been interesting now is we're seeing a revitalization of this in more progressive communities. And so this had been for a long time, the purview of the Orthodox, and it was done according to the Orthodox way. And the more liberal denominations really hadn't maintained this tradition. And I would say over the last, I don't know, maybe 30 years, we're seeing a really phenomenal growth in community Chevra Kadishas or progressive Chevra Kadishas, which will often work, you know, people from a number of synagogues coming together, training to do these things, and making this available to people who are not in the Orthodox community, and doing some really, really beautiful work also around gender and gender identity, and making sure that everyone is cared for in death as they, with the respect that for the identity that they chose to live with during life. So there's some really wonderful things. If someone's interested in that, I can recommend there's an organization, I'll write it in the chat, called Kavod V'Nichum. Oh, autocorrect is changing my Hebrew words. No, don't do that. So it's called Kavod V'Nichum, and they are a national organization we work very closely with, who train and support these more progressive community-based Chevra Kadisha, with the goal of making that ritual available to everyone who wants it, which involves also recruiting enough people to volunteer and people becoming more comfortable with the idea of not only talking about, but being present with death. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is cremation used in Jewish traditions?
Yeah, so cremation, historically, no, cremation is not, because Jewish tradition prioritizes burying the body whole and returning the body to the earth in its full form. Cremation also, since the Holocaust, took on additional meanings. So there's been a tremendous, I don't know, discomfort, resistance, etc. Of those things, of cremation. We are seeing more and more cremation becoming an option that people are choosing in the Jewish world, and there's a lot of debate and controversy around that. And you have, some rabbis who are saying, and some Chevra Kadisha who will say now, we will do a tahara and a funeral for a body that will be cremated and others will not. They say, no, that violates our beliefs and our practices. And there's definitely, we get this question a lot in our, we do a lot of programming around advanced care planning, and it comes up a lot in our conversations with people who say either, I want this and my family won't do it, or my kid wants it and I think it's awful and what do I do? Right. And intergenerationally, we're seeing a lot of change. So it's a complicated topic right now. Yeah.
And there's a question here around the tradition of opening a window so the soul can leave after some. Is that larger than the Ashkenazi Jews, or is that mainly an Eastern European?
I don't know. I mean, I know the tradition, I've heard it before. There are many of what the folk traditions.
Yeah.
That's one of them. There's also things about, which way, how the body should be positioned and which way the feet go. And there's all kinds of things. Again, a lot of those traditions have been lost, but are coming back in interesting ways. People are rediscovering them. And I don't know where that particular one comes from.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And can you reflect a little bit about your experiences and thoughts about mixed marriages, Jewish and non-Jewish couples, and then the practices and how that's maintained, or what you've seen?
Right. So I will just say what we see. We see a lot of different things, right? I see a lot of different things, and we mostly encounter it as questions that people come to us with. I will say different denominations of Judaism have different policies and different attitudes towards this. It comes up, the main things where I see it coming up is burial. Many Jewish cemeteries will only bury people who are Jewish. And so an interfaith family will not be able to be buried together in that cemetery. A lot of places are now resolving that by having an additional section of the cemetery for interfaith families. So it's a question that we advise everybody when you're doing, advanced care planning, ask those questions. When you go to buy a burial plot, make sure you ask, right, what that particular cemetery, that particular community is open to. The other question that I get a lot is I hear people say, can I sit Shiva? Like, someone who maybe didn't their parent wasn't Jewish. So then they say, well, can I sit Shiva for my parent who wasn't Jewish? Do I say Kaddish for my parent who wasn't Jewish? Or my spouse who wasn't Jewish? Or my dear friend, right? And again, like everything, right? I think the answer is it depends on which denomination you're part of and which community you're part of. And certainly I would say if it's meaningful to you and it would be meaningful to the person, you should do that. But I also think if you are part of a Jewish community, you should check with your rabbi and your community leaders about what they will support and what they will be comfortable with. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah.
I want to read this next one. Someone said, I also want to uplift the work of queer Jews during the
Yeah.
beginning of the AIDS crisis, who, to my understanding, made sure that this ritual was available, the purification, the washing, when people refused to wash the bodies of people who had died from AIDS.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't know the details of that history, but my guess is, I mean, I know that that happened. And I suspect that that had something to do with the growth of these progressive Chevra Kadisha, of people saying the Orthodox are refusing to take care of these bodies, and we are going to make sure that they are treated, as I said, with the respect and dignity that everyone should have. We saw also came up in COVID differently, but it came up in COVID of how do you do tahara when you have infectious situations. And that was a challenge that different communities dealt with in different ways. But absolutely, yes, please, let's honor the work of the queer Jewish community. And as I said, and the work that the queer Jewish community is doing today to create new rituals and new guidelines for Chevra Kadisha across the country. Particularly, the Boston Chevra Kadisha came out with a booklet of guidelines of how to do recommended policies and programs for doing tahara with non-binary and trans people, and to make sure that their identities were respected. And they're just doing tremendous work. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the final arrangement of human composting, and is that discouraged within the Jewish tradition as well?
Yeah. This is fascinating, and I thank you, Karma, connected to an article on Chabad.org. We also have resources on our website. If you go to shomercollective.org and look at our resource library, we have a number of articles about this also, or as we call alternative body disposition. Everything I've learned about this, I learned from my teacher and my boss, Rabbi Melanie Levav, who has done a lot of research into this. There has been recently several, I'm not sure I think from the conservative denomination, rabbis who have written a responsa, which is a rabbinic, a legal opinion, saying that certain forms of human composting are actually allowed, but you cannot use the compost that emerges um, for certain purposes. So like you can't use it in your garden to grow vegetables because that would be a disrespectful and inappropriate use of human remains. And Jewish law, let's just say, they can get really into the minutia. And they went into the minutia and figured out precedents in Jewish law that could be applied to this situation on human composting. And Chabad.org Chabad is a very Orthodox perspective. So if you go to the link that's in the chat now, you'll see an Orthodox perspective on that. I think on our website we have this other responsa. I'm not sure if we have it posted, but we have an article about it posted. And I don't really know that much about it, but that's what I've heard. So fascinating questions.
Thank you. And I love how you lifted up the importance of relationship within Jewish traditions and grief and mourning. And that I think that's reflected in much of what you shared. Is it also true that ritual tearing of garments, that there's tearing at different locations depending on the relationship that you have had with the deceased? So if it's a spouse or a parent,
Yeah.
Or a child.
There may be, I don't know actually.
Okay.
What I have seen typically, and I think it's you usually do it on the left side for, sort of close to the heart.
For a parent, is that right?
I think so. And I don't know though about differences.
Okay.
And mostly I think it may be because where I've been part of it or I've seen it, it's with the ribbons and less the clothing. And so then it's just a standard, you do the same thing all the time.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I see the question about books. And I will share some recommendations for you to share later, but I will say two standard books. There's one which is kind of the main sort of unofficial people, the Bible of Jewish mourning. It's a book called The Jewish Way of Mourning, Jewish Way in Death and Mourning by Rabbi Maurice Lamb, Lamm, and that is a very traditional, very, very traditional book, but it gives every detail of all of the laws and all of the practices. And then if you want a more modern interpretation, there's a book by the writer Anita Diamant, Diamant, I think. Many people know her because she also wrote a novel called The Red Tent, which a lot of people are familiar with. So she also wrote a book about Jewish mourning, and it's called Saying Kaddish. And that gives also an overview of all of the traditions, but from a more progressive and modern interpretation of them. And I find that one particularly accessible, but people who really want to go into the details of the laws, the Maurice Lamb book is the best. And then there's a number of memoirs that have been written over the years of people about their experiences with that year of saying Kaddish, and various other books that have been written to support people. I mean, I have a whole shelf behind me of books on Jewish death and dying. We're the people of the book. We like to write books. So there are many, many books. Yeah.
Gila, thank you so much. This has been a true blessing to all of us, and we are so grateful for your time and all that you put into this presentation and discussion tonight.
Thank you for having me, and it's really always a pleasure to talk about these things with people.
Great. Well, I'm sure
Thank you all for being here and for taking time from your evening.
Yeah, and everyone, I would love for you to stay for a little bit longer. We have a couple more things to wrap up, but we are going to allow Gila to sign off if she would like to. You're welcome to stay for a few more minutes, but you can also go. We're gonna just do some wrapping up.
I'll stay for another minute or two.
Okay.
For a couple minutes, yeah.
Do we have more slides, Ms. Orgizi? Oh, yes. Okay, so it's our tradition that we take a little summer break for July and August and then come back in September. So we all have a little break, but you can, if you miss us, you can watch the recordings from the previous sessions, earlier sessions. And then in September, when we come back, we are going to hear from well, it's something set up called Text by Text, weaving ritual and remembrance into text-based grief support. So this is a modern expression of grief and grief support that people are utilizing. And it can be very specific to the loss that the individual has experienced. The specific family member, loved one, also other types of losses that we have in our lives. So please join us in September for that discussion and presentation. It's going to be very interesting. And we don't have a slide for it yet, but in October, we will have Imam Burhan Hamdan from the Tucson Islamic Center, who will be presenting in October. I believe it's on the 16th of around Islamic traditions and rituals around death, grief, and loss. So look for information about that will be coming out very soon. Is this your part, Jennifer?
It is. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Your feedback means so much to us. Right about 7:30, you'll get an email from us requesting you to complete our post-session survey. So give us your feedback on tonight's session. And there is a question in there on what topics you would like to see for future sessions. So if there's something that maybe we haven't covered or you want more in-depth information on, please share your feedback. It really helps us. Our whole committee meets very soon to plan for next year. So we would really appreciate it. And as always, we are a part of the Tohono Chul here in Arizona. We're a sponsor, so we get to give out family passes for the first 3 people to complete our survey local. So if you're in Arizona, or even if you have family in Arizona, you let me know and maybe we can give them tickets if you're the winner. But please make sure and look for that email and give us your feedback on tonight's session. So with that, some information on our qualified charitable status. So if you'd like to make a donation, it does qualify for the charitable tax credit here in Arizona. Our QCO number is listed there, and it is a dollar for dollar tax credit off your Arizona state taxes. So please keep us in mind for that. And that's all, folks. Thank you for joining us this evening, and you guys have a wonderful little break. We'll see you in September. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.